It began not on the battlefield, but in the workshops, in the echo of steel on steel, in the laboratories of nations preparing for a war they refused to name. In America, where the endless plains met the machinery of industry, a gun was born out of calculation and necessity. Its inventor, John Moses Browning, had been dead for more than a decade when his last child came of age. The weapon was called the Browning M2, and its voice was the half-inch roar of the .50 caliber round. It was conceived in the crucible of the Great War's aftermath, an era obsessed with speed, altitude, and armor. The .50 caliber cartridge, a massive brass cylinder filled with propellant and ambition, was designed to defeat what men thought was the future, the armored aircraft. It was the bullet meant to chase steel through the sky. Few imagined it would one day turn downward toward tanks crawling across tropical islands half a world away. Across the Pacific, in the workshops of Tokyo's Army Technical Bureau, another conception took shape, the Type 95 Heigo, a light tank of riveted armor and lean purpose. Japan's generals, shaped by their island's mountains and limited resources, believed that speed and initiative could compensate for thin steel. The Hago weighed barely 7 tons, its armor no thicker than 12 millimeters at the strongest point. Its main gun, a 37-millimeter weapon, could pierce the light vehicles of China or the weakly defended outposts of the British Empire. It was a tank for a kind of war that no longer existed, small wars of maneuver, fought by men who believed courage could outpace firepower. Between these two machines, the American .50 caliber and the Japanese Heigo, stretched the Pacific Ocean, a space so vast that each nation could pretend the other was not yet real. The United States built weapons for a war of endurance. Japan built for the first strike. Each was confident in its own mirror. In the late 1930s, as clouds gathered over China and Europe, the Hago rolled from factories at Sagami and Osaka. Crews trained on parched fields under the rising sun. Their commanders spoke of mobility, the dash of cavalry reborn in steel. No one questioned that a thin plate of armor could stand against the modern world. Japan's empire was expanding across Asia, and against infantry with rifles, the Hago seemed invincible. Meanwhile, in America, the .50 caliber M2 was being mounted on every conceivable platform, aircraft, ships, and vehicles. It was the age of standardization of bolts and belts that fit everything. Factories in Hartford and Bridgeport poured out receivers and barrels with the confidence of an industrial religion. The weapon was heavy, brutal, and almost primitive in its simplicity. But it worked, flawlessly, relentlessly. Few saw these two creations as adversaries yet. The Hago was a spear for conquest. The Browning was a shield of the arsenal. They belonged to different philosophies, one to the samurai ideal reborn in steel, the other to the mathematics of mass production. But history has a way of drawing straight lines between distant origins. When Japan invaded China in 1937, the Hago rolled through the dust of the North China Plain, scattering ill-equipped defenders. Against the National Revolutionary Army's outdated artillery, it was a symbol of modernity. Soldiers nicknamed it the Fast Dragon. They laughed as it climbed over trenches and tore through barbed wire. The thin armor was enough when no one shot back with real power. In America, military observers took notes from afar. The Hago's presence barely registered in Washington. The U.S. Army's Mechanization Board, still struggling with its own tank doctrine, considered Japanese armor light and of no serious consequence. The .50 caliber remained an anti-aircraft and aircraft weapon, destined for the wings of bombers and the pintles of trucks. It had no defined relationship with tanks, and yet, unseen by all, the arc of development was converging. The Hago's rivets and the M2's barrel were being drawn toward a collision as inevitable as gravity. By 1940, both machines had reached their mature form. The Type 95's engine, an air-cooled Diesel 6, could push it to 45 kilometers per hour on open ground. Its armor remained the same, because Japan's industry could not forge thicker plates without sacrificing mobility. The .50 caliber, by contrast, was now mounted on everything from the P-40 Warhawk to the M3 half-track. Its bullet left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, carrying enough energy to tear through 20 millimeters of steel at close range. In December 1941, when the Pacific erupted into war, these two threads, the light tank and the heavy bullet, finally began to twist together. When Japanese tanks rolled into Malaya, their crews believed they faced only colonial defenders armed with rifles. They were right at first. The Hago's thin armor was enough to dominate the jungles. British and Indian troops had no answer except bravery and grenades. The Japanese commanders wrote home about the triumph of spirit over technology. On the other side of the Pacific, American ordnance officers studied reports from the Philippines and Wake Island. They read of Japanese tanks overrunning positions and noted almost casually that small arms fire was ineffective. The answer, they decided, lay in heavier calibers. Somewhere, a logistics clerk added a note to a requisition form: mount M2s for ground defense. It was the beginning of a relationship written not by intention but by necessity. The world was about to discover what happened when a weapon designed for the skies met a tank built for colonial war. In the winter of 1941, the Hago advanced through the tropical night, its engine humming, its riveted plates gleaming with humidity. Its crew believed in its strength. The Browning M2 waited, silent, mounted on trucks, aircraft, and soon on the ground positions of Marines who had never seen a tank before. When they finally met, the laughter stopped. When war came to the Pacific, it arrived not as a single explosion, but as a chain of detonations stretching from Hawaii to the shores of Malaya. The world's largest ocean became a battlefield overnight. For Japan, the opening months were a storm of victories. For the United States and its allies, a descent into disbelief. Among the symbols of that first lightning advance was the Hago, the light tank that rolled through jungles, across bridges thought impassable, and over men who still believed the tank belonged to Europe. In the jungles of Malaya, Hagos led columns of the Imperial Japanese 25th Army. Their thin armor mattered little. The British had almost no tanks to oppose them. Against roadblocks of trucks and sandbags, the 37-millimeter gun spoke with authority. The Japanese doctrine of shock and maneuver seemed vindicated. At Jitra, at Kampar, at Slim River, the small tanks roared down narrow roads, while infantry followed in bicycles and trucks. Their victories were tactical miracles celebrated as proof of Japan's spiritual superiority. Yet hidden within those victories was a quiet illusion. The Hago's armor, designed for speed and economy, could deflect rifle bullets, but not much more. Its crews, cramped inside the turret and hull, heard the ping of small arms fire and laughed. They believed they were invulnerable because the bullets stopped. They did not know what waited beyond the rifle. In the Philippines, the story began differently. There, the defenders were American and Filipino troops, armed with a scatter of antiquated weapons, but also with the M2 Browning. The .50 caliber had been installed on airfields for anti-aircraft defense and on a few half-tracks intended to support infantry. No one thought of it as a tank killer. Yet the battlefield, as always, was an inventor. At Luzon, in late December 1941, Japanese tanks of the 7th Tank Regiment advanced down narrow roads flanked by jungle and sugarcane. They met defenders armed with rifles, grenades, and one heavy machine gun, a Browning mounted on a sandbagged position. The first Hago approached at dawn, its commander exposed in the turret hatch, binoculars in hand. The gunner on the Browning tracked it as one might track an aircraft, leading slightly, bracing for the recoil. When the trigger was pulled, the .50 caliber spoke with its full metallic authority. The first burst struck the Hago's front plate and deflected. The second raked the side, punching through the armor near the driver's compartment. There was a flash inside the tank, then black smoke. The Hago slowed, then stopped. The gunner did not understand that he had just written a new chapter in the book of modern war. Reports began to circulate. The .50 can kill a tank if it hits the right spot. At first, commanders dismissed the claim as rumor. But on Bataan, in the desperate last stands of early 1942, soldiers learned the truth firsthand. The M2 Browning, firing armor-piercing rounds at close range, could pierce the thin sides and rear of a Hago. It was not a guaranteed kill, nothing in war ever was, but it worked often enough to matter. In those months, the Hago still ruled the open ground. It captured airfields, rolled through villages, and appeared as the instrument of Japan's unstoppable momentum. But every victory carried a seed of revelation. The tank that had seemed powerful against the Chinese and the British was now being measured against a new standard of firepower, the industrial precision of American weapons. The Browning .50 caliber was not designed for heroics. It was a tool, simple, heavy, almost crude in its mechanical rhythm. But, in the hands of desperate men, it became something more. At Nichols Field, American defenders mounted M2s on trucks and fired from concealed positions, waiting for tanks to pass. The bullets found seams and rivets, sometimes penetrating the side armor, sometimes shearing through vision slits. The Hago, with its air-cooled engine and exposed fuel lines, was vulnerable in ways its designers had never imagined. The encounter was not one-sided. For every Hago destroyed, many Browning positions were crushed under treads or silenced by artillery. The Japanese tankers, brave and skillful, continued to exploit terrain and surprise. The early months of 1942 remained a time of Japanese dominance. But beneath the smoke and triumph, the first cracks appeared in the myth of invincibility. The .50 caliber had shown that even the smallest change in weapon employment could alter the balance of power. In Burma, in the same months, Hagos crossed rivers and rolled through mangrove and rice paddy. British defenders, equipped with Boy's anti-tank rifles, found them equally thin-skinned. The light tank that had conquered Asia was already aging, yet it remained the spearhead of Japan's armored forces because there was nothing better to replace it. The American Ordnance Corps took note. Reports from the Philippines and Java reached Washington, describing how .50 caliber fire had stopped light armor. Experiments began quietly in training grounds from Aberdeen to Fort Knox. Tests confirmed what field soldiers already knew. At under 200 yards, the M2 could penetrate the side armor of the Hago. No one laughed at the notion of machine gun versus tank anymore. In the Pacific Theater, the meeting of these two machines was still rare, but inevitable. As Japan advanced through the islands, the U.S. Marines and Army prepared for counterattack. They had few tanks of their own and relied on ingenuity. The .50 caliber, mounted on jeeps, tripods, and even makeshift emplacements, became the great equalizer. For the Japanese crews, the first sign of trouble was often invisible, a spark of light, a whistle, and then the shudder of impact. Inside the Hago, the noise was deafening. The thin armor amplified every hit like a drum. The small diesel engine roared under strain, while the crew prayed that speed and surprise would save them. But in 1942, the momentum began to shift. The tide that had carried Japan across Asia met resistance at Midway in the air, at Guadalcanal on the ground. The light tank that once symbolized conquest would soon become a relic under the tropical sun. When the first American Marines landed at Guadalcanal in August 1942, they brought with them Browning machine guns, mounted on sandbags, trucks, and the perimeter of Henderson Field. The Hago would appear again, but the battlefield was changing. The Americans had learned. The meeting that would define them both, the machine gun and the light tank, was still ahead. But by the end of 1942, the laughter that had echoed through the jungles of Malaya and Luzon had faded. The war had grown harder, louder, more precise. The age of romantic victory was over. The age of steel had begun. By the end of 1942, the Pacific War had begun to turn, almost imperceptibly at first. The tide of Japanese expansion slowed, then paused, then began to ebb under the grinding weight of logistics, distance, and industrial arithmetic. The light tanks that had raced through Malaya and Burma now found themselves stranded on coral, mud, and volcanic sand. Across that same landscape, the .50 caliber Browning was multiplying, mounted on jeeps, aircraft, landing craft, and fixed emplacements, until its metallic rhythm became the sound of American firepower. War, like evolution, rewards adaptation. What began as improvisation on Bataan and Luzon became doctrine in the Solomons. U.S. Marines, learning through experience and loss, began to see the M2 not as a support weapon, but as a frontline equalizer. The weapon was everywhere, on the turrets of M3 Stuart tanks, on the sides of patrol boats, and in the hands of infantry units that no longer believed in the old limits of the machine gun. At Guadalcanal, the lessons came hard. The Japanese 2nd Division, desperate to dislodge the Marines from Henderson Field, sent in light tanks, a handful of Hagos, shipped across treacherous seas and unloaded onto beaches of black volcanic sand. They attacked at night, in rain and darkness. The jungle swallowed light, the rain drowned sound. But the Browning M2 cut through both. When the Hagos advanced along the Tenaru and the Matanikau, their engines betraying them in the dark, the defenders waited. At dawn, the first Hago crested a ridge near the airfield. A Marine gun crew opened up with a .50 caliber mounted on a tripod. The tracers, bright, deliberate, slow in their apparent arc, struck the tank's glacis, then the vision slit, then the turret ring. The armor split and peeled like wet bark. The tank halted, then caught fire. In less than 2 minutes, the first armored assault on Guadalcanal had ended. Reports afterward were clinical. Type 95 tank destroyed by .50 caliber fire at 80 yards. But what those reports did not record was the change in confidence that followed. The Marines had learned that the enemy's armor was not invulnerable. They had met the Steel Dragon and discovered it was hollow. The Hago, for all its elegance of design and reliability, had reached the limits of its time. Its armor, 6 to 12 millimeters thick, could no longer stand against the new order of weapons. Its main gun, once sufficient against infantry, could barely dent the frontal armor of the American M3 or M4. Yet Japan had no industrial capacity to replace it. The war that had begun as a contest of maneuver was becoming a contest of attrition, and attrition favored the side that could build faster, ship farther, and repair endlessly. At the American Ordnance Centers in Hawaii and Australia, captured Hagos were studied. Their weaknesses were charted in diagrams and shared across the Pacific in mimeographed reports. The results were unambiguous. Armor vulnerable to .50 caliber fire at short range, catastrophic fuel vulnerability, poor internal ammunition storage. Crews could not escape easily once hit. The Type 95, it was concluded, was lightly protected, poorly ventilated, and obsolescent. For the men on the line, those reports became instinct. They knew where to aim: the rear plate near the engine, the vision slit, the seam beneath the turret. When a Hago appeared, the order was simple: bring up the 50s. Throughout 1943, in the New Guinea campaign and the Solomons, the encounter repeated itself. Japanese tanks attempted to counter Allied landings or break through defensive perimeters. Each time they faced a forest of Browning barrels. The sound of the 50, a measured thudding rhythm of heavy fire, became a form of punctuation in the Pacific vocabulary of war. It spoke of industrial dominance and mechanical inevitability. The Japanese command, aware of the growing vulnerability of its armor, issued field modifications: sandbags on the glacis, track links bolted to the turret, logs strapped along the hull sides. None of it mattered. The 50 caliber bullet, hardened by steel core and velocity, ignored such gestures. It tore through, leaving small, perfect holes that carried devastation inside. And yet, the Hago did not vanish. It persisted, not because it was effective, but because it was available. Japan's factories could not build heavier tanks fast enough, nor ship them across the ocean. The Type 97 Chi-Ha, meant to replace it, arrived only in small numbers. So the light tank fought on, an artifact of a vanished age, its thin armor a kind of defiance against inevitability. In those same months, American production of the Browning M2 surged past every previous figure. It became the weapon of the fleet, the air, and the infantry. It was mounted on the B-17 Flying Fortress, on the P-38 Lightning, on PT boats, on half-tracks, and jeeps. Each weapon fired the same cartridge, the same bullet that could pierce 20 millimeters of steel at close range. The entire American military machine had become a delivery system for that sound. By late 1943, the Pacific Islands echoed with it. On Tarawa, the Hagos fought and died among the coral ridges. American Marines and sailors recorded the aftermath: burned-out hulls, rivets peeled open, vision ports melted from heat. The tanks had advanced through the lagoon under withering fire, and the 50 caliber had shredded them before they reached the seawall. In after-action reports, the pattern was clear. Heavy machine gun fire could neutralize Japanese armor without the need for dedicated anti-tank guns. In Tokyo, analysts clung to the belief that morale could substitute for armor. "A tank's spirit lies in its crew," one report insisted, "not in its thickness of steel." It was an echo of the older samurai doctrine: courage as armor. But in the laboratories of Aberdeen and the battlefields of the Pacific, courage was being measured in calibers, not creeds. For the Americans, the Browning became more than a weapon. It became an emblem of their way of war, standardized, mass-produced, brutally effective. It required no genius to operate, only discipline and ammunition. The Hago, by contrast, demanded skill, precision, and faith. It was a craftsman's weapon in an industrial war. By the end of 1943, the contrast was absolute. The 50 caliber had found its place as both anti-air and anti-armor instrument. The Hago had found its fate as the target that defined obsolescence. When the two met, there was no contest, only the grim confirmation of a larger truth. The Pacific was no longer a war of surprise. It was a war of endurance. The laughter that had once accompanied the Hago's early victories had long since been replaced by silence and the rhythmic thunder of the Browning machine gun. The era of adaptation had ended. The era of counterfire had begun. By the start of 1944, the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. The tides that had carried its armies across Asia now ran backward, drawing them home through the wreckage of their own victories. The American counteroffensive, island by island, landing by landing, had become a machine of momentum. It advanced not through brilliance, but through the methodical weight of industry. Every shell, every gallon of fuel, every bullet was a fragment of that larger engine. And through it all, the deep percussion of the Browning .50 caliber continued without pause. In this new phase of war, the meeting between the .50 caliber and the Hago had lost any trace of equality. It had become a ritual of repetition, the final act of a long inevitability. Yet, even as obsolescence closed around it, the Japanese light tank kept appearing. On the beaches of Tarawa, on the coral ridges of Kwajalein, on the airfields of Saipan. Its survival was not a testament to strength, but to the desperation of a nation fighting with what remained. The Hago was, by now, an antique among modern weapons. Its riveted armor plates, once symbols of careful craftsmanship, became invitations for penetration. Its 37mm gun could not harm the Sherman tanks that now rolled from American factories by the thousands. Even the light Stuart, once a peer, had surpassed it in protection and firepower. But for the Imperial Japanese Army there was no choice. The Hago still moved. It still fired. It still carried the flag. At Tarawa, in November 1943, a handful of Hagos defended the tiny island of Betio. They were hidden among palm logs and trenches, camouflaged against the sand. When the U.S. Marines landed, they met fire not from the tanks but from entrenched infantry and coastal guns. The Hagos waited until the second day to move. When they did, they moved into a storm of .50 caliber fire. From landing craft offshore, Browning machine guns stitched arcs across the sand. From the beachhead, others joined in, their barrels glowing in the tropical heat. The tanks advanced only a few dozen yards before they were immobilized, one by a direct hit from a naval shell, others by armor-piercing bullets that struck vision ports and seams. After the battle, photographs showed the results in merciless clarity. Small, clean holes punched through armor and the telltale scars of heavy machine gun fire. The Hago had not even reached the Marines' lines. It was the same at Kwajalein in January 1944, at Eniwetok in February, at Saipan in June. Everywhere the pattern repeated. The Japanese tanks appeared suddenly, briefly, and then were gone. Consumed by fire, their crews buried in steel. The .50 caliber was not the only instrument of their destruction. Bazookas, grenades, and 75mm guns joined the chorus. But it was the one most constant, the one that every Marine recognized. The sound of the M2 became the heartbeat of every landing. On the approach, it was mounted on the gunnels of amphibious tractors, sweeping beaches clear of defenders. Once ashore, it guarded perimeters, suppressed snipers, and waited for the inevitable counterattack. And when the counterattack came, often led by Hagos and infantry shouting into the night, the Brownings opened up, their tracers forming a red web across the darkness. At night on Saipan, witnesses described the battles as a storm of metal. The tanks came out of the sugarcane fields, their engines faint beneath the roar of artillery. The defenders, illuminated by flares, saw the silhouettes of the Hagos moving in line. The .50 calibers fired until barrels glowed red. Some rounds struck and bounced, others penetrated. One Marine later wrote that he could hear the bullets punching through like hammers on tin. By dawn, the field was silent again. The tanks lay where they had fallen, their crews still inside. The Japanese command knew the situation. Reports from the Central Pacific spoke of catastrophic losses, but the Hago continued to be deployed, not because it was effective, but because it was available and familiar. In Tokyo, engineers drafted plans for heavier vehicles, the Type 3 Chinook, and Type 4 Cheeto, but they never reached the battlefield. The Empire was shrinking faster than its factories could produce. In contrast, American production reached surreal levels. The .50 caliber Browning was being manufactured in hundreds of thousands. Its ammunition belts crossed the ocean in endless supply chains. Mounted on jeeps, tanks, and bombers, it unified the American way of war. Its design was unchanged, a weapon conceived in the 1920s, perfected in the 1930s, and deified in the 1940s. Simplicity was its genius. Its reliability in mud, salt, and sand gave it an immortality the Hago could never match. On New Guinea, the contrast was even starker. In the humid valleys near Buna and along the Driniumor River, Hagos attempted to reinforce collapsing lines. American infantry, now well-trained, met them with layers of defense, bazookas, 37mm guns, and the ever-present Browning. The tanks rarely survived the approach. Often, the machine guns alone were enough. The armor was thin, the rivets brittle. When hit repeatedly by .50 caliber fire, the plates fractured and separated, exposing the crew inside. By mid-1944, the Japanese crews no longer laughed. They fought with resignation and fatalism, knowing that each sortie was a one-way mission. Their commanders still believed in the doctrine of the decisive charge, the Gyokusai, the honorable annihilation. Against that, the Browning offered only mechanical precision. The two philosophies met in silence, broken by gunfire. In the skies above, the same weapon repeated the pattern. The .50 caliber, mounted in wings and turrets, tore through Japanese aircraft just as it tore through their tanks. The weapon that had begun as an anti-aircraft gun had now become the universal agent of destruction, the bridge between air and ground. There was a terrible symmetry in that. By the end of 1944, the Type 95 Hago was fighting on the peripheries, in the Philippines, on small islands, in training units turned into garrisons. Its presence on the battlefield was no longer strategic but symbolic. It represented persistence in the face of hopeless odds. Yet, even in that role, it met the same fate each time it appeared. In the archives of the U.S. Marine Corps, after-action reports describe the encounters with increasing brevity. One Type 95 destroyed by .50 and .50 caliber fire. Crew killed. No friendly losses. The machine that had once been a terror was now a footnote. The turning tide was not a sudden wave, but a rising sea that drowned the old machines of empire. The Browning and the Hago had begun as equals in innovation. By 1944, they stood as symbols of two different centuries, one born of mass production and steel precision, the other of craftsmanship and faith. When they met, the outcome was not a duel, but a demonstration. The Pacific was littered with the remains of that meeting, twisted hulls, rusted barrels, shell holes that still gleamed in the sun. On those islands, long after the battles ended, the sound of the .50 caliber would remain in memory, the relentless rhythm that marked the moment when modern war became absolute. The Hago had reached the end of its time. The .50 caliber had not yet reached the end of its use. The tide had turned, and with it, the war itself. By the end of 1944, Japan's empire was collapsing under its own gravity. The conquests of the early war years had become liabilities, islands without supply, garrisons without relief, tanks without fuel. What had begun as an offensive war had turned into a series of desperate defenses, each one more hopeless than the last. In that grim landscape, the Type 95 Hago remained, still painted in faded camouflage, still bearing the insignia of a vanished army. On Leyte, on Luzon, on the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima, the light tank appeared again, smaller now against the vastness of American firepower. Its opponents were no longer ill-equipped colonials, but a mechanized force that had refined the science of destruction. The 50 caliber Browning was everywhere, on tanks, in bunkers, on aircraft, and along the sides of landing craft. Its deep staccato had become the soundtrack of victory. When the Americans landed on Leyte in October 1944, they brought with them the full spectrum of their industrial arsenal. The Japanese 2nd Tank Division, under General Shunkichi Ikeda, fielded a mix of Type 97s and Type 95s, relics against the tide. The Hagos moved through palm groves and along narrow roads, their crews knowing that survival was measured in minutes. American air superiority made daylight movement suicidal. At night, they tried to ambush convoys and infantry positions. The result was always the same. The Hagos would advance, their diesel engines coughing through the darkness, and the American perimeter would light up with tracers. The 50 calibers, mounted on half-tracks and jeeps, opened fire first. The bullets sliced through foliage and armor alike, the rhythm of the guns merging into one sustained roar. The tanks burned where they stopped. The official reports described them clinically. Type 95 tanks destroyed by concentrated 50 caliber and 37 mm fire. But the soldiers who watched them burn saw something else, the end of a belief. The Japanese had entered the war, convinced that courage could overcome steel. The 50 caliber made that equation impossible. On Luzon, the same pattern unfolded. In the valleys around Clark Field and along the roads to Manila, Hagos attempted to stem the American advance. The jungle was thick, but not thick enough to hide them from the sound of aircraft engines and the glint of sunlight on armor. When they moved, P-47 Thunderbolts strafed them from above, each wing lined with 8 Browning M2s. The tanks, built to resist rifle fire, could not withstand the fury of 8 heavy machine guns firing in unison. The rounds ripped through turrets, fuel tanks, and crews. From the air, the 50 caliber had achieved the purpose for which it was originally designed, to destroy armor. It did so with surgical efficiency. The tanks became blackened carcasses along the roadsides, their crews buried beneath them or scattered into the jungle. Those who survived fought on foot. The Hago was no longer a weapon of offense, but a bunker, dug into the ground, used as a stationary gun position, its mobility sacrificed for concealment. On Okinawa, some were buried up to their turrets, serving as immobile fortresses in the defensive line. The Americans encountered them like fossils half buried in the earth, remnants of another time. On the beaches of Okinawa in April 1945, the meeting between the Browning and the Hago reached its final form. The tanks emerged from camouflaged revetments, firing desperately at the landing forces. The 50 calibers replied instantly. Mounted on Amtraks and Shermans, they poured fire into every silhouette. The thin armor disintegrated under the hail of bullets. Even when not penetrated, the impact shattered welds, disabled optics, and terrified crews. Within hours, the Japanese counterattack was broken. The surviving tanks were abandoned, their engines destroyed to prevent capture. Marines photographed them afterward. Hulls perforated by clean, round holes as if punctured by a machine. The legend of the fast dragon had ended in the mud. For Japan's tankers, there was no illusion left. Their training had not prepared them for annihilation by machine guns. They fought with the knowledge that technology had overtaken valor. Many crews chose to die inside their tanks rather than retreat. Others used their Hagos as decoys, drawing fire so that infantry could escape. The tank that had once been an instrument of offense became a coffin of sacrifice. In the American ranks, the 50 caliber remained the soldier's constant. Its presence defined security. Mounted on every vehicle, it provided reassurance in a landscape of ambush and unseen movement. Its slow, heavy rhythm could cut through fear. The men who fired it trusted it more than any other weapon. In their letters home, they called it Ma Deuce, a machine with personality, reliable as gravity, relentless as time. On Iwo Jima, the Browning's voice echoed among the volcanic ridges. Japanese tanks, mostly Type 97s and a few surviving Hagos, were buried in defensive pits. The Americans advanced behind a screen of .50 caliber fire. When a gunner saw movement, he fired until it stopped. The weapon's recoil vibrated through sand and bone. The tank duels that followed were brief and brutal, often decided before the Japanese crews could traverse their guns. The Hago, once the embodiment of Japan's modernity, had become the proof of its decline. Each encounter with the .50 caliber told the same story, the triumph of industrial simplicity over artisanal faith. One was mass-produced steel, the other was hand-assembled ambition. In the end, numbers and physics left no space for belief. By the time American troops approached the Japanese home islands, the Hago was obsolete even in training manuals. Its production had ceased. The last surviving examples were dug into the defensive rings of Kyushu and Okinawa, awaiting an invasion that never came. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, many were still buried where they had been left, rusting, silent, half swallowed by the earth. In the ruins that followed, American ordnance teams catalogued the remnants. They measured the penetration of bullets, the angle of armor, the thickness of steel. The reports were precise. Armor plate of 12 mm penetrated by .50 caliber AP ammunition at 100 yards. The mathematics of the war were complete. There was no more laughter. There was only silence and the sound of the wind moving through the wreckage. The .50 caliber Browning would go on, across Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, and beyond, its design unchanged. The Hago would vanish into museums and jungles, its riveted shell corroding into memory. But in the Pacific, between 1941 and 1945, their meeting had defined a lesson that would never be forgotten, that the age of craftsmanship had yielded to the age of the machine. The final confrontations had ended not with glory, but with proof, and that proof lay in the small, perfect holes cut by a half-inch bullet, a record of the moment when one century of warfare gave way to another. When the guns finally ceased, the Pacific fell silent in a way no human ear had ever known. The smoke cleared, the ocean breathed again, and the jungles began to reclaim the ground that men had torn apart. In that silence, the relics of the war remained, burned-out tanks half buried in coral, machine guns rusting under tarpaulins, ammunition belts stiff with salt and time. Among them lay the two machines that had once defined the extremes of the conflict, the Browning M2 and the Type 95 Hago. The Hago's carcasses dotted the islands from the Philippines to Saipan. Their riveted plates had peeled away like bark, their engines seized by rust, their insignia faded into anonymity. Children played around them in the years that followed, unaware that they were monuments to a vanished doctrine. The American occupation forces, methodical in their cataloging, measured the holes in their armor, photographed their silhouettes, and wrote in neat script across official forms. Captured Japanese Type 95 light tank, no longer of tactical value. For historians, the Hago became a study in misjudged optimism. Its designers had built a tank for a different war, one of mobility, reconnaissance, and infantry support in Asia's vast interior. Against lightly armed foes, it had been formidable. Against the concentrated industrial firepower of the United States, it had been fragile, almost anachronistic. Yet even in its failure, it revealed the path the modern world would take, the moment when courage and craftsmanship surrendered to production and physics. The Browning 50 caliber, by contrast, emerged from the war untouched in essence. It had fired from the wings of fighters, from the turrets of bombers, from the decks of ships, and from the shoulders of infantry. It had killed aircraft, trucks, boats, bunkers, and tanks. It was the single design that connected every branch of the American war machine. When peace came, it did not retire. It merely changed theaters. The same gun that had shattered the Hago's armor on Luzon would later defend frozen hills in Korea, jungles in Vietnam, deserts in the Middle East. Its lineage was unbroken, its function eternal. In Tokyo, after the surrender, military engineers walked through the ruins of their factories. The foundries that had once poured steel for tanks now lay cold and flooded. On workbenches they found blueprints for heavier armor, Chito, Chi-Ri, designs that had never left the drawing board. They studied the American weapons left behind, the Browning among them, and saw in its simplicity the reflection of everything Japan's wartime industry had lacked: interchangeability, abundance, repetition without pride. The lesson was not philosophical, but mechanical. In Washington, ordnance officers compiled their final technical evaluations. One report summarized the contrast in a single sentence: "The Japanese reliance on light armor has been overcome by the universal application of heavy-caliber automatic weapons." Behind that language lay the entire narrative of the Pacific War. Where Japan had built a weapon to match a belief, America had built a belief to match a weapon. The Hago would find its second life as a curiosity. A few were shipped to museums, Aberdeen, Bovington, Kubinka, where their compact frames stood beside the massive shapes of Shermans and Tigers. Visitors ran their hands over the riveted plates and marveled at how thin they were. Guides explained that a single 50 caliber round could pierce the side at 100 yards. The audience nodded, half amused, half saddened. History, after all, has little patience for irony. On the islands, nature did what history could not. Vines crawled over the wrecks. Birds nested in open turrets. The Hago's steel turned to dust, its seams splitting along the same rivet lines that the Browning's bullets had once traced. In time, only the holes remained, perfect circles in rusted metal, a signature more enduring than any flag or inscription. For veterans, the sound of the 50 caliber remained a memory that age could not erase. They spoke of it not as a weapon, but as a presence, a sound that began deep in the earth, a mechanical heartbeat that promised survival. They remembered how it had cut through the chaos of the landings, how its tracers drew lines through the night sky like handwriting. To them, the Browning was more than a machine. It was the voice of inevitability. Japanese veterans remembered something different: the moment when that voice shattered the illusion of armor. They spoke quietly of tanks burning on beaches, of bullets that entered like needles and left as fire. For them, the 50 caliber was not an enemy, but a force of nature, like the typhoons that swept their homeland, unstoppable, impersonal, absolute. Historians would later call it asymmetry, the meeting of two philosophies across a gulf of capability. The Browning was the industrial age distilled into metal. The Hago was the last expression of a pre-industrial faith. When they met, the outcome was not simply destruction, but transformation. The future belonged to the machine that could be built endlessly, repaired endlessly, and wielded by anyone. After the war, the United States standardized the M2 across every branch of service. Decade by decade, conflicts changed, uniforms changed, even nations changed, but the weapon did not. Soldiers born long after the Pacific Campaign would fire the same gun, load the same belts, and feel the same recoil that Marines had felt on Tarawa. The echo of iron continued, carried forward by design more than memory. In Japan, demilitarization erased the tank corps, but not the engineers' ambition. In the decades that followed, new vehicles would rise from factories rebuilt for peace, heavier, stronger, shaped by the lessons of defeat. The ghosts of the Hago lingered in their blueprints, a reminder of the danger of faith without steel. Time, in the end, reduced both weapons to symbols. The Hago became a relic of lost wars and misplaced confidence. The Browning became a monument to endurance. Yet, together, they told a single story of how war in the 20th century ceased to be a contest of men and became a contest of manufacture. On a quiet atoll in Micronesia, one Hago still stands, its gun barrel fused by rust, its hatch open to the rain. Beside it lies a single brass cartridge, its head stamp reading LC-44, Lake City Ordnance Plant, 1944. The bullet is gone, but the casing remains, dull and perfect. It is the simplest memorial imaginable, the meeting point of two technologies, two worlds, two philosophies. The tank and the gun, the shell and the target, joined forever by consequence. When the wind moves through the palms above it, the sound is faint but steady, like the distant echo of a machine gun's rhythm. It is not laughter and not lament, but something between them, the sound of history remembering itself. The war between the United States and Japan ended long ago, but the story of their machines endures. The Browning .50 caliber still fires on ranges across the world. The Hago still rusts in the tropics. Between them lies the measure of a century, how one idea of war ended and another began.